beginnen. Ik weet dat er nog wat mensen in de keuken staan waar ik niet over zal oordelen, want het is natuurlijk gewoon super lekker wat er is klaargezet. Van harte welkom bij het allereerste LevelUp event. Jee! Ja, echt wel een mooie kick-off. Er is super hard aan gewerkt. Ik begreep net dat er ook wat mensen in de zaal zitten en misschien ook wel de mensen die de filmpjes gaan bekijken, dat er ook wat Engelsen tussen zitten. I'm very sorry that I'm not speaking in Dutch. Excuse me, but I didn't realize that people were speaking other languages. But I'll catch up with you later. We zijn super blij dat jullie het gedaan hebben, dat jullie hierheen zijn gekomen. De mensen zowel mensen van Synetic zelf als mensen die hier misschien nog niet eens eerder zijn gekomen. En we hopen dat we jullie hebben kunnen verwelkomen met een hele warme maaltijd. Dankjewel Elja ook daarvoor. We gaan vanavond de diepte in als het gaat om performance optimization. Nou, een woord waar ik al heel vaak over gestruikeld ben, want het is niet helemaal mijn core business, maar wel die van mijn collega's. Dus ik ben heel benieuwd wat ze daarover gaan vertellen. Maar voordat we de diepte ingaan, wil ik jullie meenemen in het programma van vanavond en ook de achtergrond van het LevelUp event en onszelf even voorstellen. Goed. Zie hier het programma. Nou, ik ben Renske. Ik zal mezelf direct nog wat verder toelichten. Ik doe een kleine introductie dus. Vervolgens zullen Sam en Jeffrey zullen de introductie van de masterclass doen. We houden een korte pauze tussendoor voor wat refreshments en achteraf na de kennismaken met een lekkere borrel en snack. We staan hier in de kantine van Synetic. Ik ben dus Renske zoals gezegd, ik ben projectmanager bij Synetic en Synetic fanatiekeling eigenlijk vanaf het eerste uur. Dus ik denk ook eigenlijk dat de manier waarop ik hier sta, dat dat veel meer in die hoedanigheid is dan in de hoedanigheid als projectmanager. Omdat ik eigenlijk alle initiatieven waardoor we... sorry. Excuus hoor, even daar. Ik heb een andere MacBook van Kimberly hier gekregen. Kim, kun jij mij even helpen? Want hij ligt hier vast. Ja. Ik kan hier niet naar beneden gaan. Die is ook niet meer. Goed, zoals ik zei dus, ik sta hier veel meer vanuit de hoedanigheid van Synetic fanatiekeling, hooked from day one, zeg maar. En in dat kader ben ik graag aanwezig bij initiatieven die leiden tot meer groei, zowel in de breedte als in de diepte. En met name dit laatste is eigenlijk waar we LevelUp voor zijn begonnen. Zoals ik ook al eerder zei, we staan in de kantine van Synetic, een plek die vroeger met name gebruikt werd alleen voor de lunches en de bobbels. Oftewel voor het darten, voor het gamen, voor het tafelvoetballen en het uitwisselen van klusjesmannen thuis over de lunchtafel. Maar tegenwoordig is het een plek waar we heel veel met elkaar delen. We zijn steeds meer de afgelopen jaren gaan denken vanuit kennisdeling en vanuit initiatieven van iedereen. Verantwoordelijkheden die je samen neemt als je beslissingen neemt en allemaal van dat soort dingen. En we houden hier dus tegenwoordig ook onze Synetic stand-ups. Dat betekent dat je korte updates geeft met elkaar voor het hele team. Lekker persoonlijk, niet allemaal over de mail. We houden hier ook onze demo days tegenwoordig. Waarin je samen deelt welke successen en welke failures je hebt gehad. En we delen hier ook alle informatie die gaat over Synetic in het algemeen. Dus wat hebben we gedaan de afgelopen periode en waar gaan we naartoe? En ik denk in het kader van die kennisdeling en samen verder komen, dat dat ook de aanleiding is om te gaan starten met dit soort events. Dus het LevelUp. En in het eerste plaatje, om dat nog even te laten zien, deze, zie je natuurlijk een man die zijn grenzen aan het verleggen is en die over zijn eigen, in dit geval onze kantoormuren heen kijkt. En die verder nadenkt over wat er nog is. En dat is eigenlijk wat we hier met elkaar ook willen doen. En wat het initiatief is van LevelUp. Oftewel, up your game. En daarin geloven we dat we gewoon het beste kunnen bereiken als we dingen met elkaar doen. In de zin van samen weet je meer dan alleen. En het idee van LevelUp is niet eenmalig. We willen gewoon een event wat elke keer terugkomt. En waar mensen ook naar uit gaan kijken om erbij te zijn. We willen elk kwartaal zoiets eruit gooien. Met elke keer een ander thema. Deze avond is best wel technisch. Maar dat is helemaal niet gezegd dat elke LevelUp zo technisch is. Het kan best ook een keertje gaan over andere onderwerpen. Zoals marketing of projectmanagement of ja, heel andere zaken. Maar voor vanavond gaan we lekker technisch de diepte in. Dit zijn niet alleen maar mensen van Synetic die we uiteindelijk aan het woord willen hebben. We willen eigenlijk gewoon dat jullie ook bijvoorbeeld met onderwerpen gaan komen in de toekomst. Als je een super tof onderwerp weet of iets waar mensen sowieso iets wat speelt, ja, voel je dan niet bezwaard om dat lekker te pitchen en dan kunnen we daarmee aan de slag. En waar we op zoek zijn, dit zijn specialisten die iets weten te vertellen waar je misschien zelf nog niet aan gedacht hebt. Mocht je nou dus in de toekomst zo'n idee hebben, dan kun je mij bereiken. Ik ben in de pauze hier en ook na afloop. En ik zal dan ook wat kaartjes neerleggen. Dat is niet omdat ik mezelf nou zo wil promoten, maar dan weet je in ieder geval wie ik ben. En ook via Meetup kun je mij natuurlijk bereiken. Dus dat wat betreft het level-uppen. Ja, is zo voldoende toegelicht?
Ja.
Nou, dan geef ik nu het woord aan Sam en Jeffrey, die ons gaan meenemen in optimization.
Before we start, whoever worked with Drupal? Or never worked with Drupal actually?
Never.
Alright. Whoever written a line of CSS? Everyone, hopefully.
Views is important in CSS?
Yes. Fuck off. Okay, so let's start. I think Jeffrey is the first one to do the introduction.
Oh no.
Let's go.
Yeah, so my name is Jeffrey Bazoon, senior backend developer with Synetic. This is me. So Spider-Man is like my hero. I play soccer and tennis with Sam. Occasionally. Love to drink some beers and have fun and sport a lot. The most important thing is my life motto. It's based on the one from Barney Stinson. It's where when I'm sad, I stop being sad and be awesome instead and use CSS importance. And of course I love to travel. I often go for like a month to Canada, or this year I'm going to West America. So and I love the game. So we play FIFA here a lot with our colleagues. So that's me.
Well, with his motto, you can see Jeffrey is a very humble man, obviously. It's funny because a few weeks ago I was at his housewarming and I wrote him a little card saying, "Congrats on your house. I hope it's big enough for your ego."
It wasn't.
Yeah, there we go. In my spare time you can find me on the soccer field as well. In my spare time I also play with Lego, which is a lot like Drupal in a way, with kind of building blocks and putting it up modular. And I also, you can find me a lot on the tennis court, and I play World of Warcraft a bit too competitive according to my girlfriend. So what are we going to do today? We've got a client that we need to optimize. We've had 2 days for as a budget for this client, and it's Brinkman Uitgeverij. It's a publisher for school books. The current site is 4 years old, approximately 4 years old, and the client thinks it's a fine site, but it can perform a bit better. And that's basically what all of our clients say. It can perform a bit better. So how do we do that, and how do we manage that? So we're going to take you in the process on the front end side and on the back end side of this, on this side.
I do so.
So let's start off with the plan.
Yeah.
Jeffrey's more plan guy. Oh.
Yeah. I'm the man with the plan. Yeah, most of the time when a client comes with to us with the request to optimize the website, they often use like a Google page speed or use their network tab in Element and Spec to see, oh, my page is slow or needs to perform better. The same was with this client. We use Google PageSpeed and we're not, we weren't very happy, so we go into that a little bit. Then we go to images because in a lot of requests that's like the heaviest load you have on gaining resources on the client side. Then there's a lot of about client side usage of HTML, CSS, also a little bit about JavaScript. After that we'll have a small break, grab a beer, wine or something, and maybe talk a little bit about what we have discussed so far. And after that we go more into the depth within the code, so some real optimizations that we're going to demo that we did and show you the results of our optimizations, and that's on the side of PHP and CSS and HTML. So we use this PageSpeed Insights from Google to check what the problem was, because the client side, it could perform better. We're like, okay, perform what better? I don't know how slow it is. So we checked it, and when I saw this, I went to the corner and cried a bit, because at 30 over 100 for desktop is really bad. Mobile was a little bit better, so good job, our front-enders. And when we read the results, we saw a few topics that weren't really good, and that were all of them. So we saw that there was no aggregation of JavaScript, no minification, compression of files wasn't done, browser caching was not fully optimized, the reaction time was not that good, images were huge, and there was a lot of CSS and JavaScript that was rendered above the fold for rendering it. And that was like, for us, also a pretty new topic. We don't spend a lot of time, but I will explain a little bit. The above the fold principle is about all the files that you load in the header, like CSS or JavaScript, that need to be loaded before showing the HTML, which means if you have like 20 files in this case, the HTML is rendered once those files are loaded. So when you have a lot of files, like 20, and a lot of CSS in it and a lot of JavaScript, it could take like a half second before the initial rendering of the page is starting. And what the above the fold concept tells you is that try to minimize it as much as possible and only include the files that are needed to show the page above, like the top side that's shown on the initial page load. So if you have like a screen, show this part of the page and the CSS, and move everything that's needed for below it down to the footer of the page. Which means that you can like reduce the amount of CSS to like 25% needed to just show the banner and the menu and maybe some grid system, and the rest can be loaded later, supplying like footer styling or some page headings or whatever. But we're going to skip that because that's a lot of work and we only have 2 days. So we continued on, and we used the webpagetest.org, which gives you a nice result about the statistics of the website and the performance of it, but also the content type breakdown for the type of files that you're loading. So if you look closely, there's like 4.5 MB of images loaded. So we're like, what? JavaScript was 260 kilobytes, CSS was 65 kilobytes, so that's quite a lot of data to be loaded. The video we knew because we have like a Vimeo video that's being buffered in the top of the page. But the rest was a lot of data that might be compressed somewhat. How can we do that? The easiest fix to do it is implement a CDN, and in this case Cloudflare. Cloudflare has the feature that it can minify, compress gzip, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, and also optimize your images without touching a single line of code. The only thing you have to do is set up your DNS a little bit differently, use a name service from Cloudflare, pay $20 a month, and your site is being optimized on the go. So you don't have to do anything, just use your website as you do. And especially with international websites and CDNs, the delivery of your content is being done globally. So it's optimizing the route to the files and also decreasing the amount of bandwidth that your server has been using. And we ran this for like 6 hours. I show it here. This was after 6 hours after we turned it on. It already used 270 cache bandwidth that our server didn't have to handle anymore. And that was just turning it on and not even that many requests. So that's the easiest optimization that you can do. And you can do it just by paying with a subscription. But there are also some hosting fixes that you can do for Nginx and Apache using the page speed mod from Google. I put the links here. The whole presentation is going online, so you can follow the links and the documentation. So you don't have to pay the $20. So that's the choice. Another solution to optimize images is using Photoshop. So tell your clients to use Photoshop and buy it and use it effectively and reduce everything that's not necessary in image. There are also some tools like Resmush It. It's like an online service that you can use, but still you have to integrate it somehow with your application or tell the client to use it. And there are some server-side tooling like JPEG Optim and stuff, which also require a lot of development to integrate them in your application. So my advice is use some standard solution that will do it for you. That's a lot of less work. And with Cloudflare you get a lot of extra services as well. And it's a content delivery network, but the features are being extended as the service is being developed. So there are a lot of advantages there besides just the file optimizations. After we turned it on, we got the results on the right. So we went from a score of 30 to 49, and with mobile we went from 67 to an 80, and that's without even touching the code. So okay, that's one green light, another one to go. But why is the desktop still not that optimized? And this is the Dutch version, I'm sorry about that, but it says that there's still 1 megabyte of saving to be done on an image that is being loaded. And that's only 28% of the original file. So I'm like, what? That means it's like 4 MB. Apparently, we are loading a file with a size of 7,500 pixels wide and 3,000 pixels height for a website. So that's ridiculous, of course. And yeah, so tell us why.
Wasn't my fault, it was the client. So how are we handling optimizing images? Well, first we're going to start with implementing the picture element. Picture element has been implemented, I think, about 2 or 3 years ago in the browser. And it makes you handle images much better for every kind of device. Traditionally, you have the image tag where you just put in a source URL to your file name and some alt text. But with picture, you can set up your source files to switch the image based on what kind of width you're at. So, for instance, I got my image, my normal desktop image, or actually my desktop image, and then I see then I do everything above 0 pixels will switch to mobile, everything above 768 will go to tablet, and everything above 992 will go to desktop. This is a pretty easy way to deal with images, and it's being used, or you got it in your browser as well, so might as well just use it. What you can also do is you can adjust the image size as well. That means on traditional way you've got the image and it will scale proportionately on each device. But with this way you can just set up different kind of sizes for each kind of device, which makes your image much more optimized for each device. I made a little table which you can use when setting up your responsive images, because you have to make every kind of image for each device. So how this will work is we got device width check. That's the one we're going to use. So let's say we got this image for Brinkman here, and we're setting up the size to the 9x1 image size. And we're checking in our browser what the actual size needs to be. And you can see here it needs to be 931 versus 430. And that's the size we're going to use. So if you're going to apply this to every kind of device width, you can basically set up your images pretty quickly with 5 steps. You can use this table whenever you like. So we've handled the images, but how are we going to optimize the HTML and CSS? Because that's what the browser will render eventually, and that's where you can optimize a lot of it as well. We have to go back to the principle of the design of a website. And for this we're using the atomic design principle. This is like, I think it got discovered a few years ago, but the last year it's becoming very popular and we're using it as well. It means we're looking at the smallest kind of object on the website there is. So we got the atoms, and these atoms are being showed inside a molecule. These molecules form an organism, and this organism can be used inside templates, and eventually it will render your page. So for instance, if we're going to take a look at the Brinkman website, and we're going to take the banner section, you can see there's a few atoms available here. We got the button right here, and the title, and the image itself. Obviously there are more kinds of atoms, like this button, and this title, and this image. But we're just going to use this as an example. So we got 3 atoms here, which are being showed inside a molecule, which is the banner, and the banner is being showed inside a region, which is the organism. If we apply those multiple regions, we get a template. So we get like the header region and like some other regions for adding the menu, for aligning the menu and the logo, and we got the content as well. And together they will form the page. So this principle can be used on every kind of website or tool you're building. And what basically does is this helps you think about your site architecture. It also helps you recognize patterns inside a site or a page, and it makes your components reusable. It also makes sure your code is more structured and makes more sense, which ultimately makes sure your code is performing better. And we did some refactoring of some elements, which we will show after the break, and you can definitely see a performance win on those elements. At Synetic we're using tools for this. We're using PatternLab, which basically is a pattern library with all of your components and your atoms and molecules that are available to use for our backend developers. But you can use all kinds of things. I think there are a lot coming out in the coming year, and the last year I think 3 or 4 new ones have been added. But you can use Fractal or Aston. I highly recommend you take a look at it and see how those works. Because the thing with those pattern labs is they're framework independent, so you can use them. It's not just for Drupal, but you can use them for any site like WordPress or Joomla. And every major company is using these kinds of pattern libraries. Like for instance, we got MailChimp, where it just shows a few of those components as well as the code. And so every developer, or if you've got a client that's got another client that wants to use your code, can just look at those patterns and see, okay, what kind of HTML do I need for this block, and how do I render it? And what kind of variables as well, you can edit it. You edit it there as well. Well, I got another example like Audi. You can see the fonts and what colors they use, and what kind of components there are available on that site. So how do we handle those patterns and those molecules, and how do we deal with those naming conventions? So for CSS we're using the BAM methodology. We switched to BAM I think a year ago. We went from SMAX to BAM. Does anybody know what SMAX is? It's it's more of nested CSS. Like for instance, if you have an image and let's say you have an overview item of a book for Brinkman, and you've got an image, you make a class called book, and inside those book class you'll nest another class with image. With BEM mythology, you don't need these kinds of nesting inside your CSS, because your class just immediately shows you what kind of element it is. So the BEM mythology stands for the block, element, and modifier, and your CSS classes will be written on this as well. So let's say I've got here an example, which we have some tabs next to each other, and together they combine the molecule, the navigation. On itself, the tab is called an atom, so we can use navigation, underscore, underscore, and tab if we want to select that element with CSS. I got this example which is pretty small, so we could use a modifier on the tab if we want the thing to be smaller, or you could use something like active as a modifier class on your atoms. But you can also add the class directly to your block element. For instance, if we want this navigation to be vertically aligned, we could just use navigation vertical. So for CSS we're using SAS, which I think, does anybody not know what SAS is? It's pretty standard, it's like a way of pre-processing your CSS. The thing with SAS is some people can just abuse the SAS system, because you can nest so much inside your selectors that ultimately your SAS will become SCSS because that's what your browser reads. We have done a few scans, and I think a few months ago we did a scan for another site where we had a client just basically put in his entire DOM inside the CSS or the SCSS. So we had selectors like miles long, which we couldn't deal with it at all. We're using Gulp as a preprocessor tool to preprocess our CSS files or our SCSS files to CSS. And here's a little small example of how this will work. We've got the HTML here. As you can see, the UL is nested inside the nav, and it will ultimately process towards the nav UL thing. And you can also use variables inside the code, which will just deal with it with CSS. So that means you have to define the color only once instead of defining it multiple times and copy pasting your variables the entire time. You can use functions, mixing, loops, and all kinds of other stuff. CSS is becoming more and more modular instead of just writing regular CSS. I've got a little example here. What you would normally do with JavaScript, like if we click on this menu, you can see the items flying in. What we could do is write a little JavaScript that just adds the classes on the LE and write just one line of CSS, which does the animation. But it's easier if we just write a small SCSS kind of code, which adds a few milliseconds to what each LE, and basically that handles the animation, instead of writing a JavaScript, which is much faster. Well, this is basically my life. It looks good, right? As long as it aligns correctly, it's fine. And then here I am. It's also what every product owner and every client says, and there I am just optimizing every kind of CSS and HTML possible. Because writing CSS is fairly easy. To align something in the middle is fairly easy, but writing it correctly and make it maintainable and scalable so other people could use it is something else. So how does CSS actually work? If we style something on an inline attribute, we can say it has 1,000 points. If we style something on an ID selector, it will have 100 points. If we style something on a class or a pseudo element, pseudo class, it will have 10 points. And if we do it on an element, it has 1 point. Every line of CSS you see will have some kind of points related to it. If you've got a lot of CSS and you want to test it out, how much CSS it has, you can just put here your CSS in, and it will ultimately give you the graph of showing how much specificity your entire code will have. For instance, we got here an icon which has a specificity of 10 because it's just a class, and here you can see a specificity of 221 as we're using two IDs and two classes, as well as some other elements. The thing is, you want to keep this line as low as possible, because the lower it is, the more maintainable it is for other developers to work on it. And I will get to it later, but it's also very much faster, your CSS, when writing it on less selectors. I got some examples here. If we got the UL, the LE, and the A, which are 3 elements, then we got one class of active, and we got the ID of navigation, which is a combined point system of 113. Then we got here 3 classes and two classes and 3 elements, which is 23. So you can apply this to every kind of CSS code. Because how does your browser actually read your CSS? And I want you to look at this selector, and I want you to say, how does your browser read this? Not you. Can anybody say how your browser will read it? Or what do you think it will read? Nobody? Make a guess. Tough crowd.
It scans all the A elements or something like that, from left to right?
From left to right, so it will check the UL, and it will check if your UL has a class of social links, then it will check your LE, and then it will check your I. Is that what you're saying? That's what you think it will do, because CSS your browser will read your CSS from top to bottom. So automatically you will think, well, your browser just checks all the lists, then it will check if that list has a class, and it will contain an LE and I. But actually your browser reads it reversed. It will first check if your selector, if your page has an A, it checks if your A is inside an LE element, and then it will check if the LE element is inside the UL with the class of social links. What that means is if you have a page with a lot of links, like the startpagina page, and the client says, well, we're going to update the site a little bit because it's like 200 years old, and we want little social links in the top corner, and you style your social link like this, what it will do is it will check all the A elements, it will check if it's inside the LE, and then it will check if that LE has the class, or if the UI has a class of social links, which has a huge impact on the performance. So what you could do is just add a social link class where your browser will only see, oh, I got 4 social links, and it will render much quicker on your page. We call this the reflow time. So the reflow time is the name of the web browser that processed for recalculating the positioning and geometries of elements. And when we're developing, we want to reduce the reflow time as much as possible, because the lower the reflow time gets, the more optimized your CSS will perform. There's an article on Google, which also is related to your Google's page speed, which you can read more about this, and it will go in depth more about this. But your reflow time can be different across different kinds of devices and different kinds of machines. I've got a little code here that basically just calculates the reflow time of a selector you're using. So we got the class here, and you see if I create this, it got a page load of 26 milliseconds, which does, I think it does 1,000 selectors. But if I add an ID here, I think it's caching actually. Now it's not cached. So we got the, if we got the ID and the class, we got 136 milliseconds. And if we're just using the class, it's 20 milliseconds. Just because your CSS is being cached quite good by your browser, on the first page load you want to have the optimized CSS as possible, but this is a tool where you can just basically play around with. And that's the break, that was it.
Are there any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, the image tag,
Picture tag.
the picture tag, yeah.
Yeah.
So does it only load the image that is needed by the screen resolution?
Yeah, based
Yeah.
on the media query.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if you resize your browser, it will change the image directly on your page.
And then only it loads the
It
does
loads
the request.
only for that screen width.
Yeah. Okay.
So as you can see, it wouldn't load 3 images on your desktop device. It will just download the desktop device image, as well as for mobile. It will only download your image files. It makes. We've got an example for Brinkman as well after the break, where we show how much speed we're actually gaining by implementing this technique. But it's actually quite a lot, because you can snoop off a few KB for each device, and if you got like 20 images on your page, you can optimize it by, let's say, a few megabytes.
Okay.
And every browser supports this except IE. Of course, obviously. But it doesn't really matter because IE is not being used on a cell phone, so we don't deal with that as well. It doesn't really matter if it's IE.
So the extra image tag in there is the backup for IE.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
But how your browser will read this is it will change your source set inside your image source tag. So it will, this line of code will just go on this source tag on the fly if you resize your browser as well.
So you style the image tag, not the picture tag.
Yeah, but you can also just set the class on this image tag, which is better. Instead of, like, when I'm writing CSS, I tend to avoid styling on every HTML element. Because if we're styling on an HTML element, we're giving too much context to our CSS selector. Let's say you're styling on an H2, and in a few months your client wants to change that H2 into an H3. It's just changing the H3 to an H, or the H2 to an H3, and it's done, instead of rewriting your CSS again. So we'll always add a class to elements and style on that class instead of styling on the HTML elements. Obviously, you got your default styling as A and LE and UL that you will have to style on, but for every kind of element, for components and banners, we never style on HTML classes.
And coming back to the media query, is there a significant difference in performance when performing a media query in HTML versus in CSS?
What do you, like writing a media query in CSS? Or?
Yeah, for example, if you were to set your image as a background image for a container instead of using an image tag.
Well, the loading time doesn't really matter because it loads in the same image.
Okay.
But if, and we've got that example for Brinkman,
Okay.
because what happens if you're using a background image and you want to position it covered to your container, you've got like one line of CSS which you will have to use is background size cover, and then it's fixed for every browser. So we cannot use this principle here, but we've written some fixes where you can just use the picture element also for a background image. And you really see a massive difference, because if you're writing your CSS 4 times for different devices, it will still load in the images of those 4 devices, because your CSS is being rendered by your browser. And by doing this method, it will only change the image based on what size you're at, instead of loading every image.
Okay. Interesting.
Another question.
Yeah.
What's so important about the important? I mean, does it also affect load times or performance or whatever? Or
Yeah.
you shouldn't use it at all, right? Does it have effect on that score you told about?
Yeah. Let's go to it a little bit more. Well,
This
everything has a score, but using important is always the most important. So we will override every kind of thing. If we're using important, we basically get fired. You don't want to use important ever. And there are a few edge cases where you actually want to use important, and that's on helper classes. For instance, if you're having a class of a text align center, you could use just text align center or text align center imported after it, because your class is already saying it needs to be align centered. So you could just use an imported for that. Or if you want to float something right, and you've got a generic class called float right, for instance, you could just use an important selector. But the thing with important selectors is if you have to override it, you have to use another important. And if you have to override that one, you have to use another important. And eventually, you end up having code like this. Go to code then. Let's just create a little box. Which has some content in it. Just going to put this on CSS as well. So, no. Apparently code pen was your completion. So we have this box of a background green. If we're adding an ID to it, which has box 2, and we override this ID, now it would turn red. But yes, a little bit slower. If you're entering your important class, and you say this will always be most important. But I just told you about the points where IDs are 10 points. You would think that if I do my box and I actually copy paste this 10 times, and I will add another styling, and I need to remove the important as well. It will still be red.
Spaces in between those boxes. Those are nested boxes.
Oh.
You box in a box. Boxception. Nice.
Yeah. What I have to do is add 10 classes here as well, and then style it. But the thing is, those point elements are different kinds of points. Each ID class and elements are different kinds of points. So it doesn't work like this, that if you're writing 11 classes over an ID, it will be more important. Your ID will always be more important than 100 classes. And I think there's a bug in Firefox where if you write something with 265 IDs or classes, it will actually be more important than the ID. But who writes a line of CSS with 256?
Easter egg or something.
Yeah. But the thing with important is, if you're using important and you want to use a media query, you will have to use an important again. Eventually you will end up with a lot of lines of CSS and nobody can read it anymore.
So your score goes up.
Yeah, your scores go up way more.
Yeah.
So you never want to use importance. I don't think there's any way you will ever need to use importance as long as your HTML and CSS is set up correctly. If you know an example, I would really like to know one.
I used to use WordPress with all this CSS with, that comes with a theme, and you just want something different. Then you use you add your own style.css file and use the import statement. Say, hey, I don't want this green, I want it red. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, for WordPress it's really important.
So that triggered me. Said, what were you talking
Yeah,
about?
like for using that kind of writing code is fairly easy, and I would say using an important then is probably the best solution, because if you're writing, if you need to overwrite something, you will have to go through the lines of CSS to actually be a different color.
Yeah,
and
or
then,
change the theme or.
yeah, indeed. But when you're developing a website, if the theme is set up correctly, you don't have to write an important. And I also do I got some site clients besides here, and which also bought like WordPress themes and Drupal themes, and I will end up having to write really nasty CSS in order to fix the styling, because the theme you're buying is not optimized very well. It performs very well, it performs good, like everything is laid out perfectly, but the CSS written in those themes are probably pretty horrible. And you can optimize CSS so much. I can, on one component, I can work a day about it. Or, zeg je dat in het Engels? Als ik één elementje heb en ik werk daar een hele dag aan, dan ik kan de hele dag bezig zijn met het optimaliseren van mijn CSS, zeg maar.
Dus als je wat hebt dit weekend, hij heeft waarschijnlijk niks.
Ja.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Other questions?
About the images,
Yeah.
you say about the pictures and the source sets.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of stuff do you use for rendering those images to sizes what you want? Because, for example, we use Famba as an image provider that just scales on the fly and caches it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have something like that, or do you let it render by Drupal image styles, or?
In Drupal 8, you've got the image responsive images module, which is in core, by the way.
Yeah.
And they made a fallback for, you say,
The backwards.
yeah, they made a backwards compatibility module for Drupal 7, which also enables you to make responsive images. And what it actually does is you'll create different kinds of image style for each breakpoint, and you can make a breakpoint group, and you can select those breakpoint. You can add image styles to that breakpoint group.
Did you ever measure the performance about doing it that way and then rendering all the images from the same domain name, or using like a CDN with an image provider that does it on the fly? Because then you use a different domain name, which also helps, I guess, with the browser performance, instead of your own domain, which probably sends a lot of cookies with it and whatever.
Yeah, but with if you're using the picture tag, what your CDN does, as long as one person has visited that site, it will change that image and actually provides that image to you the next time.
Yeah.
What we've had with another customer is,
But then you
with AOP.
But then you do the Drupal responsive images in combination with the CDN.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we let the Cloudflare just cache the images from the first time they are requested. So we don't have to worry about serving it. And essentially it does the same as your solution, of course.
Yeah.
Because we use a third party that will serve it, but for us it's on the same domain name. For the browser, at least.
Yeah.
But actually it's Cloudflare that's serving those resources.
But it does render the images on disk then too, right?
Yeah.
But there's one bug in Cloudflare which we had with using the picture element. Because the thing with CDN is it will only provide that image as long as one person has checked that image on that width. So it means that if you've got a page, you'll have to load the page on mobile, tablet and desktop in order to make sure your CDN is providing all of those images.
And optimizing them as well. So the reducing of the size of the images, using the CDN to strip off all metadata and stuff. That's only done when somebody is requesting that images. So the first person who requested the image won't have the performance optimization, but the next one will.
And I think Cloudflare hasn't implemented a solution where they will just go through each source set and just cache the all of the images for each device in one go, instead of just only using the source set.
Yeah, okay, but you can go easily around that, of course. Just previewing it on your own.
Yeah, you can use it like a caching primer or something.
Yeah, that sounds easy, but for this side we, I think we had about 2,000 products, and we don't want to go to each product to render each image.
But there is a new implementation now going on within Cloudflare. It has workers to prime content. It's an experimental feature now in Cloudflare. So that's stuff that is being developed on the go right now. But that kind of stuff is very interesting, because if they have workers to prime that content and to request that content, then you don't have that issue anymore.
No. But I guess that's not really a big issue, because the performance optimization you still get because you don't load the whole big image.
Yeah.
Maybe you wait 5 milliseconds longer.
Yeah, when we show you the results, it doesn't really matter anymore.
Good. You do it?
This is for loading images in the templates rather than content, is it?
That depends if you're using what kind of CMS you're using, but I know there are plugins for WordPress which will compile your normal image into the picture element, and with that plugin you can just choose different sizes for each device. So yeah, it ultimately ends up in your source code, but there's a lot of CMS systems that are implementing modules and plugins in order to make sure the picture element is supported as well.
But like, so as I was saying, like, this seems to be more for the template and for a developer, as opposed to a content user uploading their own images.
Yeah.
That's not really true, because in Drupal we're also using pictures and also using pictures that clients can edit and upload themselves. But when you're using a plugin or a module, you can extend it with other kinds of plugins where the user can just set up his own image size on each device. So the user will upload the image, the regular image, and then it's got a little JavaScript box where you can set the height and the width of that image, and it will automatically scale to what we have given the image.
Using a server. So
Sorry?
Using the server will resize.
Yeah, like the GD library to
Yeah,
resize
so at
them,
that
or
point
image magic or something.
So what I'm saying is, it sounds as if one is made choose between optimization with a CDN or Photoshop or something like that, or using a system where you upload your image and it's kind of done for you.
Yeah, or a little bit of both. You know, it depends on the combination of tooling that you want to use.
But that's more of do you mean like this, where the optimization happens, or
Yeah,
do you mean the
yeah.
responsive?
Well, kind of here, yeah. I'm trying to imagine what options the end
Yeah,
user would have.
Resmashit is a tool you can use on your site, but you can also install it on the server. There is a module for Drupal called image optimization, where you could use Resmashit, and it basically gives you these libraries where you can optimize each image and each image type as well, for a JPEG and PNG. The thing with this library is you can set for each type your own optimization settings. So if you got a lot of images with transparent backgrounds, you might want to use a different kind of setting as if you had PNGs with no background. You can set it for each file size or file type.
And these are also command line tools, so you have to have access to the server to install them, of course, or you have a hosting provider who is willing to do this for you and give you access to it.
What we'll normally do is we host it on our own server, because we don't want to rely on the party if it goes offline. But yeah, it does. You need some server configuration to do for that.
We always like them.
Cloudflare does it for you as well. It optimizes your font and compresses it.
Just a little bit, but a little bit more than nothing.
There is one more thing. I think you could safely use only WoW2 for fonts. Because if you're using a font face, you've got the, normally, if you're downloading a font, you've got the OTTF and the WoW and the WoW2 and the SVG. I think I got a graph somewhere, I have to check it out in the break, but you can safely use only WoW2 and it will show on each browser. I think the only browser it doesn't do is Internet Explorer, so you need an EOT fallback for that. But that really helps you save a lot of time as well. Because what your browser will do is it will try to load in each font types instead of you just doing the one he can render. So for instance, Firefox uses the WoW2, but he also downloads the EOT and the SVG, which you don't want. What you could also do is just use Modernizer, and you can select if he has to check for the fonts and write your font selector that it will only apply if it actually exists or if your browser uses that font type. So you can specify which font is being loaded on each browser type. That also helps on your performance. Yes? More?
Break? Beer?
Beer?
Yes.
Je kan altijd gewoon op het hoogste niveau van de losse velden bij die alle kanten gaan laten vinden. Maar die dan zijden en mensen laten die dan heb je gewoon uiteindelijk dan meer in de som van de het is wel heel normaal omdat je het maakt het altijd wel op een gegeven moment dit ideaal is om een half jaar Ja, je kan ook gewoon nesten. Maar je kan dan ook... ja, dat klopt. Ja, en dan ga je op in de grond. Ja, nee. Dat is echt wel een maar dan word je pas gemerkt op een gegeven moment. En als je wat in lijn is, ja, wel een beetje geen dit wordt nog gestreamd, hè? Ja, maar ik ga terug.
We begonnen ook met een beetje onze plan kwam van ja, de website dit was op de Google Page. Dit is een site die super oud is, gewoon weinig geld en dat is een beetje af en toe kleine dingetjes. Nou, op een gegeven moment was je SEO bezig. Ik zag gewoon in de rekening en dat soort dingen. Dit helpt me ook. Dus op een gegeven moment ook, weet je, dan merkte ik wel dat er heel veel factoren waren die gewoon weinig dit had ik even uitgelegd, maar dit zijn dingen die veel tijd in dus dat skippen wij eigenlijk altijd. Maar ja, weet je, wij hebben gewoon een image, gewoon de frontpage, gewoon 400 MB. De CSS is dan hier 65 KB en met een JavaScript is 250 KB. HTML is valt er nog mee, maar WordPress is ook 50 KB. Weet je, op een gegeven moment, ja, hoe kan je dit doen? Daar kwamen ze bij Cloudflare. Cloudflare levert ons in de eerste sessie, maar dan heb ik 270 MB minder data vanuit de server op, gewoon door van Synetic te schrijven. Dit zijn gewoon zeg maar gewoon die CDN. Niks voor, het zijn wel namen. Ja, nou ja, zeg maar de 50% van de internet die niet meer zijn dan ophalen. Ja. Nou, wij hebben tot nu toe ik merk wel dat bepaalde dingen daar wel een Cloudflare biedt voor veel mensen kopen sneller. Ja, het is fantastisch, maar het is wel een risico en het is ook een maar het is bepaalde dingen gewoon heel makkelijk op organisatie. Wat ik net ook uitleg, je kan heel veel tooling zoals ook Facebook, ik kan ook zelf gewoon server-site. Dan laat je het adviseren door Cloudflare, laat je de organisatie op zeggen, ja, dat kan je niet doen, maar dan moet je het zelf doen. Maar dan moet je het zelf gaan inrichten en dan moet je kijken naar de ja, nee, ik weet het wat ik zeg. Maar dat is een afweging. Nee. Maar dat is een afweging die je op een gegeven moment moet gaan doen op basis van klanten en dat verschilt ook. Alleen dit was dat.
Maar even, dan kun
je op een gegeven moment achter, dus de afbeelding geüpload of zo, die zei dat helemaal niks. Daar zijn ook mensen aan. Dat is gewoon heel deze lokale versie voor de rest. We komen straks nog wel bij een stukje data, maar dit is CSS en PHP-vragen.
Nou, ik kwam binnen inderdaad ook omdat
ja, misschien was het voornamelijk als je hier bent. Ja, dit zijn dingen dat inderdaad op een bepaalde stijle klas maakt het echt niet uit. Ja. Op een gegeven moment gaat hij ook straks iets over Bootstrap doen. Hier Bootstrap 3 op staat, van Twitter, maar heel stil. Maar we hebben niet heel veel nodig. Dit systeem, 3 is gebaseerd op REST en 4 is gebaseerd op SAS. We hebben een aantal gewoon target views maken. Ja, op een gegeven moment gewoon resources vooruit zetten. Ja, maar kan ook zetten. Ja, PCBO. En voor klanten is het vaak als je gewoon een cijfer maakt, maar komen er niet de nood. Dus met titel, whatever, zelf, alles eigenlijk een bepaalde code proces opmaken, waar staat er, vertellen hoe het verbeterd is. Ja, bepalen.
probeer ook te doen.
Nou, nu heb ik al layout ja, het enige wat je eigenlijk moet doen is zorgen dat je daar steeds weer van layout hebt. Die dat je gewoon eruit dat je ook ja, maar dan kijken we ook hoe je dingen maken minimaal duren. Dus je eigenlijk met hem deze planning doet. We hebben ook snelheid nou ja, dat is toch wel lekker.
Zodat we een presentatie voorbereid en dan gaan we betalen. Oh, daarvoor? Ja, ik kom er even. Ja, hallo? Hoe is het erin ja, met de koffie token. Ja, dan mag je dus eigenlijk gewoon alles. Dat is heel mooi. Zo tegenover. Ja, we beloven ook wel dat we aanbereiken. Ja, maar ja, leuk dat je het bent. Ja. Ik hoop dat zal wel vragen hebben bijvoorbeeld specifieke vragen die tijd stellen en antwoord het is moeilijk om alles te raken als je het ja, dit is de eerste jaar. We hebben ook doen waarmee we veel mensen kunnen bereiken. Dus mensen die laten aanvoeren en werken doen. Daar een bepaalde zoiets van oké, laten we een use case pakken. Daar is dit. Ja, ja, we zijn nog niet alleen. Zo oud we zitten nou op fase 6, 7. Ja, maar ja, ja, nou ja, dat gaat als je niet wil tijd dat is hoeveel groter is, dat het makkelijker is om te zeggen dat je niet in de gaat. Met een auto, maar ik laat vaak volgens mij wel zeggen dat het wel maar het is eigenlijk nog niet voor mee bezig. Nou ja, de laatste 2 maanden, omdat wij ook echt gewoon meer van de lijst van het land. Dat is dus het eerste jaar. Dat kunnen we doen. Niet nadenken over het persoon heeft. Ja, je kan er een paar staan en volgens mij is het alleen dat dit soort dingen dan wel weer. En je kan ook gewoon ook ja, wel verstandig. Ja, dat is verstandig. Ja, hele missen. Hier. Elkaar zitten, dit lager is wel flexibel. Ja, dat is heel veel. En ook die content bepaalde dingen. Leuk. Tof in elkaar zetten. Maar ik heb een nieuw plan die dus nodig is. Dat is wel zijn. Ja, dat is buiten plaatsen. Dan kan je zeggen, ja, als dat zo is. Dus was altijd heel spannend om heel groot. Maar dat wil eigenlijk wel een app. En je gaat naar de markt. Ja, ik zeg ja, nee, die is heel lang. Dat is organisatie lagen zijn. Die is het beste dat is gewoon deze producten in orde zien. Dat zit in je supply chain. Wat wil je ermee? Wat is nou verstandig? Met een lager verhoogd. Ja, dat is geen keuze. Dat zijn ook gewoon leveranciers.
Nee, ja, je kan ook met elkaar zeggen tijdens het testen van, hey, wacht even,
Je werkt. Nee, ik weet het wel.
ja, precies.
Dit is hoe het moet zijn. Juist, dat is wat tof. Checker plugin systeem. Single niks aan. Er is nog een plugin voor bestemmen. Maar je kan zeggen, wat bouwt het? Checker van de rest is bij supply chain backend. Kan deze klant dit product bestellen?
We hebben verschillende teams. Eén is met dat soort dingen. Eén is voor de auto's. Eén is voor
snel. Jee, ja,
nou ja, maar hij is gewoon, ja, als hij zegt 10.000, 30.000,
dat is het grootste wat we nu losgekomen is.
We doen aan het project, daar verleden hadden wij heel dus zijn we best beetje. Als in de praat, zeer makkelijk. Zolang natuurlijk achter de best wel gooi je gewoon de universiteit. Projectcomponenten, en op een gegeven moment zijn er platformen. Wat wel fijn is, dat vind ik wel mooi. Hun visie is ook wel ja, het zit eigenlijk zo dat over de die is allemaal een stap richting 0,9. Ja, zit eigenlijk volledig in de ja. Nee, dat is meer op dan is het functie zie je deze ja. Nou, ik maak wel een slag. Ja, dat is dan vaak als we een beetje hebben. Ja, deze zijn allemaal aardig elkaar. Ja, maar ik bedoel dat ze heel fijn zijn. Maar we hebben een project. Daar hebben we je hebt zo dat is gewoon stil dat het niet bedoeld is. Maar en dat zijn elke pagina een nieuwslijst. Dat gaat tegen daar zijn wij met ja, Als je wat voordeel van hebt, dan geeft dat een systeem, een prijssysteem. Dat kunnen we niet hebben, want ze hebben een systeem. Dat zegt maar de tijd van de daar wij krijgen dus per bedrijf 40.000 prijzen. En ik zeg eigenlijk dat wij zijn, maar 90% dit is al prijs. Super handig, natuurlijk een prijs voor prijsgroepen of zo. Dus
Ik vind het niet erg om hier hoor.
dat is gewoon niet te doen. Heb je niet meer in de kan ook. Dat is nog steeds niet. Maar goed, geen eigenheid om te gaan. Regio, dat de percelen is en dan ook die nog en over school en op die met wij ik ben toevallig dus oh dat is het en hij is nog niet zo bezig een keer mee met we zitten met features ja, formulieren worden een hele de rest van gekozen en dat ze niet over alles moet er ja, dan weet je dat ik wel zo alleen is ja, maar als je eigenlijk begint met alle goede wetingen van de hersens dat we nu installaties blijven samen aan de server. Hoe dan? Is het zijn van de wij zijn dus we zitten dus kon weet je wel, dat is wel een reset als gedaan.
Ja hoor, veel plezier.
Ja, ik zie dat niet terug zien te halen, maar zo'n bekend is dan onderhaal. Maar zeker dat ook nog. Dit is gewoon je file. Zo min mogelijk gaat wel en dat is nu ook dat veel nagedacht bij maar dat maakt het dus ook een stuk we zitten met de ook dat kan je video's gaan als dat op maar dit moet geaccepteerd worden. Dat staat altijd te accepteren.
Ik zou wel zeggen dat je dat met een dat was bij mij thuis.
Nee, ik ga ook. We willen elkaar als kind leren kennen. Ja, ik heb laatst bij die gasten gezien die aan de klas bezig waren. Dat is in ieder geval 7 was. Die hebben dat een keer al gezegd. Het is heel makkelijk. Je kunt niet daarna uitmaken. Je moet het is alleen maar voor. Ja. Ja, Het was iets wat ik tenminste, ik heb niet verder nagevraagd en hoe verder zijn het ook mensen, maar ik zag dat ze wel actief zijn. Dus ik ben benieuwd hoe dat dan zit. We hebben naar Lezen dat wel. Hij zit op een toko. Hostingomgeving. Zelf waarbij thuismodel nou best wel ligt. En in feite met verder resources nodig hebben. Ja, weet ik veel, maar niet nou, ik weet wel of het bijna oud is, maar je zit nou een oud database. Dus je database mag ja, dat snap ik ook niet. Ja, dat weten we niet, dus we weten niet hoeveel je daarvoor moet betalen. Het zit niet in het rekenmodel. Rekenen gewoon. Public files, applicatie, public files of dat is het een betaalmodelletje. Dat is er ook bij. Plus vanuit de kwestie. En dat kan best wel, als je veel precies dat is soms best bij. Ja, die kwestie is heel duur. Het best van. Dus hij al heel ja, maar inderdaad, dat is wel database van die denk ik in je hele test is gewoon per meespeler als ja, zo staat het even zo. Wat? En zij was niet daarmee te managen. Dat die gaat vanzelf gewoon resources verhogen. Dus die zegt gewoon, hé, we threshold bereikt, kwam. Weet je dat niet op jou gaat, dus zijn ook dus wij werden daar heel en ik moet niet boos voor het ja, zo'n gast die waren maar die zit nog slecht in de kast nog direct vraag, maar waar ik niet eens plan dus 2 weken lang lopen spelen en ze reageren. Ik zeg gewoon een omgeving met het is gewoon aan. De postfout die je vrouw voor je omgeving, die gebruiken dus ook. Dus dat is wel fijn. Maar ook nou ja, kijken naar. Maar ze zijn echt heel gasten. Ja, ze waren wel blij. Ik heb alles kapot gemaakt. Ik word dus enthousiast als ik de laptop daar neerzet aan de staattafel. Ik zeg, nou, ik heb als we opzetten kijken voor het project aan de raad. Groen dan die boer. Elke ding was dus blijkbaar. Dat je last minute.
Ja.
Disk image van plaats, van locatie, of de download is niet vinden van de locatie. Wisten ze, maar niet dat ik custom setup die ik wou testen voor een hele specifieke situatie. Want maar allemaal testen, dat is heel specifiek waar. Dit werkt, weet je. Nou joh, het is één fout en ander en gewoon paniek. Shit, was met alles in die gaat overvol. Dus ze waren daar van mij kicken issues uitgekomen, dus er zit een lachen. Hij gaat ons testen, maar zij zijn niet echt heel klein apparaatje. device, ja, dat is gewoon een soort van voorbeeld opgesteld. Dus je zegt van dat hun netwerk is gezet met documentatie hoe het werkt. Je zegt ook, ja, als het in de weg valt, gaat het gewoon overal verder. Ook dat zien van een inderdaad van wanneer er bij moet komen, dat gaat super snel. Ja, dat is echt. Nee, maar ja. Ja, dat is dan ook. Ja. Dus ze zitten wereldwijd, ze hebben heel veel locaties en afspraken mee aan zitten. Dat was namelijk ja, er staat. Ja. Maar die hebben ook
Dames en heren, we gaan weer verder.
Hij gaat ook. Ja. Ga je weer daar zitten? Waarom heb je muziek aan? Dat is leuk. Ik hoor het nog steeds.
Okay. So let's start. Yeah, I will start talking about PHP and more server-side setups about what you can do with performance optimization. And the easiest performance optimization you can do is one. Upgrade to PHP 7. It's like an instant 50% performance increase that you can gain just by upgrading. The biggest issue that you might have is that your code is not PHP 7 compatible. If that's a worry that you have, start by upgrading to 7.0 and just check out what kind of errors you have. I know that 7.1 has somewhat stricter setup about what's allowed and what's not. Drupal, for instance, Drupal 7 should be PHP 7 compatible, but with contrips and stuff you never know. We have here currently the mindset that we want to develop locally on PHP 7, so that every fatal error or every issue that we have with PHP 7 we can tackle on the go when developing for our projects that run on PHP 5.6 and then Drupal 7 to make it PHP 7 ready. And one of the things that you can see, the HHVM here is the one that Facebook has for a long time, the custom PHP version they built with their own just-in-time engine. And the upgrade to PHP 7 that's been done is, well, almost on the same level. So yeah, it doesn't really matter if you consider PHP 7 or that anymore. It's just go for PHP 7 and make your whole life on performance perspective a lot better. Another one is currently with decoupled and headless, the whole APIs and services and that kind of stuff. You have XML, that's mostly older system, and you have JSON. When it comes to larger data sets, XML performs worse. It's not so much that you can't use it or that you shouldn't use it, because some systems don't offer anything else in XML. But JSON is, especially with larger data sets, a lot more efficient. So I put up the graph. This is something, I don't know where I got it, but I found it somewhere with an article that I read some while ago. there are two perspectives that you can check the performance on. One is the memory usage, you want to execute the time. On the small data set, you can see that with XML, simple XML performs a lot better. It has a smaller footprint on memory. But when you go to the larger data sets, you see that JSON wins. So in that case, you can consider like a trade-off with smaller data sets. You use XML, but mostly just try to stick with JSON because that's the way to go for most new services and REST APIs and such. So that's an important performance gain, especially with large listings or data sets that you want to import or migrate or do whatever. Another thing is, it's mostly default now, but opcache caches your compiled code in PHP. Most hosting environments deliver this out of the box, but check it out anyway, make sure it's turned on and configured correctly. If not, you might lose like 50% of your performance just because this is not enabled. So this is something that you can check on your hosting environment. Another concept, I didn't know it was called this way, but using static variables, you can cache certain calculations that you can do within your PHP code. It's called memwise, and well, you can read it, but in computing, memoization is an optimization technique used primarily to speed up computer programs by storing the results of expensive function calls and returning the cache results when the same inputs occurs again. So, for instance, if you want to, I don't know, calculate ESMC squared or something, and you want to do that like 10 times for the same variables, why do it 10 times over again in the same request? Instead of caching the whole calculation, put it in a static variable, and if that specific calculation is done before with the same variables, just return it. And don't recalculate again if you already done it in the same request. This often occurs within Drupal 7 as a Drupal static function for the people who are familiar with Drupal. But it's an easy thing also to reduce database calls, you know. Give me the last, I don't know, 10 users that have been registered. Use it for, I don't know, purpose A, purpose B, purpose C, I don't care, but you want the 10 less created users. And if you request the same function like 10 times, you have to do the same database call with the same parameters 10 times over, creating an overhead on your DB, instead of just caching the same results and reusing it for the same purposes on multiple outputs or use cases within a certain request. And there's some micromanagement. I had a small discussion in the break here about small optimizations, and during the day during work. It's really stupid, but these kinds of small changes, like preventing the use of a file size function, file time, and file exists as much as possible, will reduce some latency. And it isn't much, but it's the sum of all latency that you create in your code that eventually creates a larger latency that will make your application perform less than you might want, especially when you don't have to do it. So doing a file size 10 times on the same file and using memoization to prevent that and just doing it once will optimize your site somewhat. The same is with some string functions. You know, a preg replace is really slow compared to this one, and string replace is somewhat in the middle. So read about which string transformation functions you can use and what the performance gains sometimes are. Will make you more aware of the performance impact it can have. I often debug code in Drupal, for instance, and some people are really more like a preg replace kind of people, you know, use preg replace for everything, while they just want to replace like the first 40 characters or something. And if you just do a substring, it's a lot faster than using a preg replace for some situations. Single quotes versus double quotes. This is really micromanagement, but the double quote situation will try to find variables they can inject within the string. So that is a check that PHP will try to run on that string. So preventing that by using single quotes will really little bit optimize your page. But if everybody is aware of this throughout every composer library or every single piece of code that you use, the sum of those improvements will really improve. Maybe 10 milliseconds, maybe 500 milliseconds. It depends on the amount of code that's used. But compared, the sum of all optimizations will eventually really be a big gain, which we will show. Comparisons, if you use the triple equal versus the double equal, for variables will somewhat form as well. Yeah, memorization is something I told you before, and cache storage. Yeah, if you calculate and gather data that you want to reuse in multiple situations, I want to gather some users from here, I want to gather some profiles from an external system and whatnot. Try to combine those data, cache it and reuse it using, I don't know, can continue like in a memcache or MongoDB or Redis, but I'll continue on that later. Those are development principles. If you try to think about how you can optimize and reduce certain calculations, you can optimize your application significantly. DB queries. I'm not a scientist with this stuff, but enabling the slow query log, configuring a threshold that might be useful for your application, and analyzing the log to see where certain bottlenecks come up will help you detect and improve your code. Some queries might have certain joins or certain requests to tables that are not optimized, missing certain indexes, or using orders, sort by or group bys that really create temporary tables, and using file sorts that have a negative effect on your application. I added some documentation here that you can read through, but there's a lot of interesting stuff about covered indexes. If you use those correctly when requesting data from tables, and it's covered in those indexes, you don't have to get the data from the disk. It will just return the data directly from the index itself. Mostly indexes that contain multiple columns are combined indexes, which are only used for sorting queries. So you have like a query on, and you want to, I don't know, a user with a certain group and a certain range of date, and you have an index on those three columns, a combined index. You'll probably have pretty effective situation, but if you also want those specific columns to be returned, and only those columns, a covered index will increase your performance, because it would give the results directly from the index instead of opening the table from the file disk and get the data. So that's something you might, if you really want to improve it, might be something you use. What's interesting is if you have slow queries in your log, copy paste them, put it in, I don't know, an AdMiner or database tool or whatever you want to use. Put explain before it and see how it performs. Explain will show you the way MySQL will search through the indexes and give you a feeling of the amount of results that they have, and have to look through till they find the number of results that they have. For instance, if you have a table with 10 million records and the only index you have is on the primary key, and you are looking for, I don't know, say it's a price table with 300 million records, and you only have a primary key on the ID, and you just want to have a certain list of prices within a certain range, how will MySQL filter through those results without indexes on, I don't know, the price table? So it means that they are like, okay, so give me every price, and I will look through them one by one. Oh yeah, this is within the range. Okay, next one, next one, next one. Instead of knowing the ranges of prices that they have through the indexes, filtering every possible result that's not in range and gone, and just give the result based on that index. So that will really be an improvement that you can apply if you use it correctly. But there are also people who overuse indexes, because if indexes are that fast, why not use it on every column? Every update, insert, and delete that you do will also have impact on updating those indexes as well. So you have to think about what kind of queries will I run? What kind of conditions or joins or whatever am I going to use? And think about how smart you can build the indexes to optimize those queries. There's also some configuration that you can improve. This is something from Percona. I read a lot of articles from those guys. They, like MariaDB, they have their own version of MySQL. And they have a lot of performance enhancements done and a lot of tutorials. And these are the 4 most important settings that you have to look through, and with their advice about how you can set them to a setting that's more appropriate and more performant. So I don't know if you have your own hosting provider or you do it yourself, but these are interesting stuff to look at. I put that article at the top. We already talked about reducing database queries, especially with memorization, but that's on the request itself. So then you have performance gain during the request, but what about the results that you have gained and you want to reuse them over multiple requests? So that's where cache storage comes in place. Memcache and Redis are currently probably the most known systems to use for this. These are key value storage systems, which means you think of some kind of identifier for your data set. For instance, if it's about users and their affiliations with, I don't know, certain groups of people like Al-Qaeda, I don't know. You have like a user affiliation with the ID of the user and perhaps other parameters. You serialize the data, put it there in the cache storage, and the next time you request it, you just check on this cache storage, is the data for this ID available? Yes? Excellent. Give it to me, then I can use it. I don't have to gather it from MySQL using relations, joins, and all that kind of stuff. I can just get it in one call and just use it. If not, I can build it using all those methods like in database query or whatever, and then store it as well. I have an example for this later. Front end, we can skip that, right? So we'll continue back to the front end because there's obviously also somewhat.
Yeah, so we've talked about the server optimization. So the last hour you've heard a lot about the theories about how to perform the site, and now we're going to actually look at what we've done a couple of days to make sure this site performs a lot better. And we're going to start by optimizing a component. In this case, it's a banner, which we're going to optimize. And I have to switch my laptop first because my local environment is on the other laptop. The luxury of having 2 laptops. So if it works. See the image. Alright, so I've just made a little example HTML. We've got 2 banner elements. This is the unoptimized version and this is the optimized version. We're just going to inspect this element. You can see on the start, can you guys read it, what it says here, or is it too small? Too small. this better?
Yes.
Okay. As you can see on the get-go, the first class is called image with content, and I immediately think, okay, this class is not good. The reason why is because if the client wants the content to be gone in a few months and only wants to show the image, we're stuck with this class called image with content, but it has no content. So we don't want to use this class then. And then we got a div with the image background, and as you can see, the image background is nested within the image with content class. So it uses a specificity of 20. It also uses a fixed height, which I don't like, because the thing with fixed height is if I'm editing this kind of code and just add a few lines here, you can see it goes beyond my container, which I don't want. And obviously this title is not going to be this long, but we also know that in a few weeks' time the client says, oh, I want the banner a little bit smaller, and then he adds a little bit longer title, and then it will be too long. So we don't want this. That's one. Then there's another thing. If we check this class, it says the content class, but it's a pretty general class, which you can use on basically everything. So with this class, you will have to nest it within another class. In this case, it's image with content. Also, to make sure it is this width, they've added some framework classes which specify the width of the how your framework handles with the grid classes. For instance, if you're using a 12 columns grid, and this uses a 5 columns for large devices, it will have a 40% width, because it's 5 out of the 12. This is also something I don't like, because if you're using your framework classes on these kinds of elements, you're actually ik hoor het betaling is.
Google Translate.
Yeah. You actually need to have your framework CSS in order to make sure it aligns correctly. And if you want to get the banner as a loose component and maybe switch as a framework or not use a framework at all, we're stuck with the entire grid system of this framework. So we don't want to align this with the grid classes from your framework. Then it uses here a P class, which they want the styling of the H2, which I don't really like as well, but the thing is, as you can see with the CSS as well, it's styled on the P element and the H2 elements, which means that if I change the P to, let's say, like an H2, my CSS will not work anymore. Also, if you look at the buttons, you can see there's multiple classes added to the button for making it different. If I delete these classes, it will just show the regular button as default styling. But in order to get this styling and have these classes, I will have to nest it within my current class, like using multiple selectors in order to style it correctly. There's one more thing about the background. The background is currently being done with the background image. This was the example that you gave me by adding just a background size cover to it, which is fairly easy in CSS because the banner is larger than its container, so we want to cover it to cover the entire container. But the thing with this solution is that we cannot use a picture element anymore because it's not covered. You cannot cover a picture element according to your parent. So how do we handle that? Because there is a solution in CSS. So what I've done, I've rewritten the HTML, and it will just have the div of a banner. And we'll do a little JavaScript class that handles my image alignment for lower browsers, because for the image we're using a CSS code which is called object fit cover, which basically does the same as background size cover, but then on an element. If I disable this, You can see it. Oh, my image is aligned perfectly on the container, so you won't see it jump. But if I rescale the window and disable those styles, you will actually see it jump to a different size. Then, instead of nesting my banner class inside my other selector, I'm only using one class now, which has the banner content class, and I've added some media queries in order to do that, because on mobile we wanted to scale differently. We wanted to go on the bottom, like as you can see here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add some media queries to make sure it's differently aligned on the desktop by only using one class. If I go in the selector, instead of styling the title inside my other selector, I'm just using one class, which is called banner title, according to the BAM methodology. Then we have the button. Instead of using multiple classes to style this button, I will just give the button some modifiers and add some default styling to it. I will have to nest it on an H element because I had to deal with the legacy code. But even then, I was able to reduce my specificity by quite a lot. If I go to my, this is the HTML which I just showed you, where we got all the image elements.
Can you zoom in?
Yeah, sorry. Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we got the old code, and this is the new code, which is much more structured. And we're using, most importantly, we're using the picture element in order to make sure each device gets another image. What I've first done is I got all the images, and I did them through Photoshop. This is the original image. As you can see here, it's 170 kilobytes. Oh,
And then it's black.
that was my HTML or AUI table. Yeah, we got image again. So the original image was 170 KB, and I just did them through Photoshop. I adjusted the quality of the image by like 20% because it didn't really make a difference, that 20%. And I was able to reduce that 170 kilobytes into 30 kilobytes, which is a reduction of 1/5 of the original image. I also could reduce the image for my tablet landscape with 3 kilobytes and my portrait with quite a lot more, by 11 kilobytes, and I was able to snoop off 3 more kilobytes for my mobile device. So let's take a look at the CSS. This is the original CSS. I will just zoom in a little bit. As you can see here, it gives the display block, but the div is by default already a display block, so we don't need that display block. Then you can see here he does the background image with the covering and the fixed height. And this is the content container. Also something I don't like is that they're using a padding of 0 and another padding on the right and the left and the bottom. But the thing is, if we're deleting the title, because the title will actually get the padding on the top, it will not get the correct height. Or this is my optimized version. Let's go to the old code. Yeah, as you can see, the thing is not aligned anymore. It doesn't get the right padding around the entire box. So this is a thing I don't like and I want to change. Here we're using the icon, the quote icon as a before, which, well, it's fine actually. And this is another thing which I just told you about. They're using one HTML element is a P and another class. So I've rewritten this code, and here they're using some media queries to show something different on desktop. But the thing with this is, or on mobile, the thing with this is on your mobile, your CSS will read all the CSS, and then it will read out your media queries. If you're doing it reversed, like mobile first design, instead of a max width, you're using a min width. So that's what I use. And with this, I'm using the Bootstrap media queries that it's giving me. Bootstrap has some really nice functions and mixins that you can use. I will highly recommend you to actually go through all the CSS that Bootstrap provides you, because there are really some interesting stuff going on in what Bootstrap provides you for writing your SCSS. So instead of using an absolute positioning for the content, we're going to use Flex in order to make it scalable. And we're also, with Flex, we can also just make sure the content is to the right side on the bottom. I will tell a little bit more about Flexbox in a minute. Instead of using a fixed height, I'm using a minimal height, so the content will just scale accordingly if it's larger. And as you can see here, I'm not actually nesting my selector inside another selector, but I'm extending the class name, which will eventually end up in processing my CSS into this with one class name. I have to use a positioning absolute on the image to make sure it aligns correctly, and I'm using the object fit cover. But the thing is, with cover, it's not supported by Internet Explorer, and most of our clients actually use Internet Explorer because we make corporate sites, so we do need to have a JavaScript fallback for that. For the content, we're just using a general padding and generally the same CSS as we just had, but we're also adding a media query which does a mobile first approach. I've just written a small fallback for all the browsers, because all the browsers doesn't support Flexbox, and this way the content will not go all across your entire container. We're keeping the icon as it is, and the title we're editing as well, just by adding one class instead of two selectors. This will end up in having this code for your mobile instead of this code for your mobile, and it reduced my CSS by half of it. Just by rewriting my CSS for like an hour or two. For the image fallback, because we want to have all the browsers also support the covering of my image, we're just checking with the modernizer if my browser actually. We're just checking if my browser supports object fit method, and with that we're only doing my JavaScript once, because if you have Ajax on your site where content is loading on different elements, you don't want the JavaScript to apply multiple times. We're getting the container, and we're also getting the source of the image. Then we're just doing it regularly as an old way, by putting the background image on the container and actually just covering the thing with regular CSS.
Can I ask one thing about this one?
Yeah.
Why are you searching from the base of the DOM and not from the context?
Yeah, I should have used context here, but it's not been reviewed yet. Good thing, I should edit it.
Put it on the list.
Yeah. So if we go back to my CSS, I got my fallback here, which basically does the same thing as it already did. It just does the background size covering. And the thing with this method is it will also, for mobile, it will get the mobile image, because that is the source of your image file, because you're using the picture element.
So,
yeah.
you're using inline styling
For what?
right now.
Yes, on all the browsers. So I don't mind, because it's old shit. We develop for newest browsers, and we just want to have a little fallback for older browsers.
If it's IE or old, we don't care. Shit code for shit browsers.
Are you also using, like, this takes into account older versions of Chrome and Firefox though as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Because object fit works on every browser. It's just a library which checks if your browser is supporting object fit. And we also made a gulp plugin which will automatically detect if I have a CSS class or a JavaScript class, which we want to do on some modernizer thing. it automatically creates our modernizer files based on the classes we used. So we've got an image reduction just by changing the background image to a picture element and putting it to my Photoshop and resaving it for web and devices. We got an image reduction of 82%. We got 3 kb less for landscape, 11 kb for portrait. So it means on mobile the images were 8% faster than the original image that was previously done, which is quite a lot. What I just said about the object fit cover, the thing with this and what they used to do is with JavaScript, you just had a little script where your image is actually just proportionately styled to, accordingly to your container. With this method, it's just one line of CSS, which does basically the entire JavaScript library. Actually, this library was being used on Brinkman, and I wrote a little fallback around it as well, so it will be done for all the browsers, and we're just using the CSS for newest browsers. Yeah, here you can see the support, only IE, and there's a bug in Edge, but it works on images for Edge, and that's the most important part, because that's probably there's probably the thing you're going to use it on most, on images. Then we took a look at the overview of items on that page, and I want you to take a look at this image and just check it out a little bit, and I will come to that later. Just take a look at this image, and I'll have a question about this later. Because we had the overview, and we started by we're using Bootstrap as a front-end framework, but we used to use Bootstrap and load in the entire CSS of Bootstrap. But the thing is, with the Bootstrap CSS, that is quite large. It takes like it's about around, I think, 8,000 to 10,000 rules of CSS, and where you probably only need a few of those lines. For instance, if you only have a site which uses a model or a carousel or something like that, you only need those lines of CSS instead of every CSS. So what we've done is we upgraded to Bootstrap 4.0, which uses SAS, and we can just load in the SAS file we need for Bootstrap. Only the components we need. So on this side, we needed the grid for the items to be aligned next to each other, and I think we needed the tabs navigation and the model. But those were the only 3 things we needed. The rest we could just delete. The difference between 3.2 and 4.0 isn't by much. There are a few changes in class, but in essential, the way the CSS is written is a lot different than 3.2, because the main reason is for grids they're using flexbox instead of floats. We'll get to that a little bit later. But after rewriting the entire SCSS, we had a reduction of 40% of the original CSS lines. So if you're using a front-end framework, make sure you check out for the file names. What are the names of the CSS files, and are they set up modular? Check if the front-end framework uses default variable after your variable names, and check for importance, because the more importance there are, there's probably something wrong with it.
To smell.
Yeah. And what you can also do is check for the specificity. The higher your specificity is, the crappier your framework probably is. Or if you want to buy a theme or something, I highly recommend you to check out the CSS and check for the specificity. If the specificity is very high, your frontend isn't really working well. So I told you about floats and flexbox. which doesn't directly have an impact on your performance because it's just a CSS selector. But the thing with floats is CSS was originally invented for document styling, for large kinds of documents. If you had an image on your top left, you would just float the image left, and if you had an image on your right, you will float it right. But the thing is, now we're having so complex layouts. We want to avoid using floats. Then there's one more thing with the float. If you're floating an element, it doesn't do anything with your parent element. So the thing is, we got here some elements inside the parent. We're all floating elements, and after that, the parent cannot see the height anymore. Obviously, there are some fixes for that, like using a clear fix and then an after to actually clear the height, or an invisible element that's being rendered after the actual float, so the container can get its correct heights. Or you can use an overflow hidden, or what they used to do in the histories, let's say. They made an anti-diff, which has the class clear, and so they clear it. But those are kind of nasty things. So I told you about this image. What's the first thing that strikes you?
They're all the same height.
Indeed, they're all the same height. Because that's what we have to deal with as a front-end developer. We're getting ideal designs. All of these titles has 2 lines of titles and 3 lines of descriptions. But in reality, we've got books that have like 1 title, or books that have like 3 titles. So what we used to do is, for Brainmon, it uses a script that fixes this, and it will actually get the largest parent or the largest element on that row and make sure all the siblings are the correct height. It works kind of neat, but we don't want it for optimizing our page, because there's a lot of load on this page using this method. Also, if you check out this thing, you can see here the sidebar is float left and the main content is float right. But we cannot do this with floats because we cannot make sure the sidebar is the same height as the main content. So we will have to use some JavaScript to make sure the things are aligned correctly, or we could just do something nasty about positioning absolute and make sure the height is still correctly. But then we have to write some additional CSS in order to make sure it's correctly on mobile. So we don't want to do that. But there's one more thing that's wrong about floats, because writing current CSS is more made for the Western world instead of for the entire world. The thing is, it's called the World Wide Web and not the Western World Web. So when is your float left really a float left? Because if we're taking a look at this page and we see the sidebar on the right side, but we want it for Arabian countries to be on the left side, is your float left still your float left? And let's go even further. Let's go look at Mongolian systems where the site is being rendered on another level. Is this still your float left? What on your page is your float left? CSS is actually starting to get away from these kinds of methods by using absolute positioning as left or right, and they're going more to directional based systems as flow or direction or justify or align. Flexbox does the same method, so you can better align items vertically, even horizontally, and it's more direction and flow based. It also does a lot more with your parent and your child's instead of your float elements. And there are many more things about Flexbox which I highly recommend you check it out. It's been implemented in the browser, I think, a year or 2 ago, and it's really high. There's a really high coverage on it as well. The coverage is around 89%. We use it regularly on a lot of sites. The thing about Flexbox is you really have to look for what kind of website it is and if your client are using old browsers. Because if you're building your entire layout based on Flexbox, you can have the possibility that your entire layout is being torn apart for older browsers. So you can also use it a little bit more progressively on items you only want to use where it doesn't have a high impact for older browsers. I also highly recommend you you check out CSS Grids, which has been implemented in a browser a few months ago, and it basically makes sure you're able to make your own CSS grids in the browser instead of using a framework, front-end framework. Something like Masonry, where all your image is being loaded, like what's called Flickr, or where your image is being loaded on different heights and floating next to each other. This can also be done with CSS instead of using JavaScript, just by the CSS grid. So I highly recommend you using CSS instead of JavaScript because it's a lot faster and it's a lot more performance win. Because CSS is loaded alongside the HTML, whereas JavaScript is loaded after the page load itself. CSS is generally faster, unless you're using really complex transitions and animation, then you should use JavaScript. Because CSS is used for layout and visual representation, and JavaScript is not. And the browsers are more and more working towards complex layout and making sure front-end developers having the tools in the browser for making optimal layouts. And as I said, really check out CSS Grids. You can check an article here which goes in depth about using the CSS Grid and has a lot of specs. You can also just make your own regions in CSS and assign your boxes towards those regions. So your HTML order is not that much important anymore. You can just create a box somewhere on the bottom of your page and place it anywhere in the grid you like, instead of having a set order for your HTML in order to float it correctly next to each other. The support for CSS grids is around, I think it was 81%, but it's still increasing every month. So yeah, check it out and play with it yourself. Now we're going to go back to the backend stuff.
So yeah, we know how to use importance now. Next we're going to really optimize some backend code and implement some of the theories I explained before. And to know where the bottlenecks are in your application, you need some kind of tooling to read out what your application does, you know. What kind of methods with Symfony and using composer libraries. There's a lot of code and a lot of libraries that you don't have the complete understanding of. So it's quite necessary when your application has performance issues to analyze it on a way that doesn't take too much time, but gives you results and an indication of where to look for. These are two tools that I would recommend for your hosting environment when it's a test, acceptation, or even a production environment. They have configuration to like randomly or based on certain thresholds to start their investigation on a request. And they work together as well, because Blackfire is like profiling, more of a profiling tool which goes through all the PHP functions and just checks out which method calls which methods and how long it takes, how much memory usage there is, really in depth. While New Relic does that as well to some level, but has a smaller footprint on the application. They say it has like a 5% performance decrease when it's activated on a request, but it has some configuration about when to start this for a certain page that might have certain delays. And if a certain page request takes too long, they can start, I haven't dive into that, but they can start Blackfire as a result of that process. So New Relic can steer Blackfire to, okay, this page sucks, tell me what's going wrong here and notify me about it. So that can give you some information from production to be assertive to your client, instead of your client being angry about the application being not performant. And you can offer insights into the application and quick solutions. But as a developer, it's nice to have the graphs as well to see how they work. So although these are commercial tools, yeah, you can have the trial versions and experiment with it. It's really interesting. What you can see here is they work more like a transaction system. So there's certain transactions, you see how long they take, and when there are certain spikes on certain pages, you can filter also on if it's a MySQL transaction, MongoDB, PHP or whatever. So it's quite interesting. Maybe I can zoom in a bit. I don't know. Can I? No. So that's quite interesting. They also have integration with your error logging and violations and threat profilers. A lot of stuff that you can use without having too much impact on your performance. Then we have Blackfire. This is like, yeah, the online web-based profiling dashboard that you can have that really gives detailed insights in the way your application behaves. What you see here is like a schematic of the methods that are called and in the order and, okay, something's going standby.
You need to press a button.
Oh, have you tried turning it off and on yet? You see here, this one is called like a single time, this one 13 times, this one 379 times, and if each call takes like 10 milliseconds, those 10 milliseconds can increase to like a second, etc., etc. So this is really a way to see on what calls you can increase your performance. But as a developer, we love to have our tools locally. So Xdebug, which offers insight in how your code behaves using breakpoints, also has the way to profile your code. And this creates like a profiling file that you can explore using certain tools. This is a screenshot from QCacheGrind, but PHP Storm has the tool integrated, or a similar tool integrated in PHP Storm. But side note for that, there is a bug in the current version of PHP Storm for the latest version of Xdebug, so you have to wait till the first quarterly version of PHP Storm to see that fixed. And there's WebGrind for Windows. KCacheGrind is also one, and I don't know, there are some alternatives for OS X as well. And what you can see here is this is like the percentage of the current request that method takes. So this is like the main something, the first call that's done to the application. That's like 100% rounded, so sometimes it's like over 100%. It calls some kind of include, then goes through a cycle that's called 1126 times. That calls another one, another one, another one, and has this kind of graph. And you can go through it. We'll go through it in a minute, so give me a second. To have this switch. You have to have the necessary tools implemented on your development environment. No signal. Oh, okay, here we go. For starters, add an add-on to your browser like Xdebug Helper for Firefox, or there are similar extensions for Chrome or whatever. This gives you a small, simple add-on to start your debug session, but also your profile session or a trace. In this case, we want to profile, of course. If you haven't installed Xdebug on your development environment, look for a tutorial. Mostly in most default setups, it's already supplied, but it's really easy to install. Then, what's quite handy is some kind of setup to create profiling files, because you want to find them somewhere. So the profiler output directory, try to set it up in some location that you can easily find and watch it. I placed in app/xdebug as a folder, and there are configuration methods to determine what the output file name is. In my case, I use the process ID of PHP within my process list combined with the request path, so that I can make a difference between like an image call or an Ajax call and the front page call, or I don't know, detail page call. The default is, I think, call grind dot process ID, which doesn't say anything about which call it does, especially with an application that does multiple requests to like Ajax API backends. These settings are determined to how profiler is enabled. I've set it up that it's default not enabled. If you set it on 1, it will profile every single request with or without your browser add-on. And this one is with a trigger, and the trigger is in this case my browser add-on, but can also be a cookie or a parameter in your request. So, well, I already did a profiling action. This is one for the front page of Bing One. So what you can see here is this is Drupal 7. These are the calls that are fired on the first on the highest level. So there's like a Drupal Bootstrap thing that only takes like 5% of the total request runtime, but the main is the menu executive active handler. So that's probably in this case the request that's done to the Drupal logic about give me some content and show it to me. So okay, this is 94%. Okay, what are you doing? Well, I'm rendering my node page. In Drupal terms, that's like your main content area. That's like 10%. Okay, I can get that. I mean, it's the main content that you want to render. But 84% goes to a delivery of the page. So if I have the main content, what's it doing besides delivering the main content of the page? Well, if I click through it and go down and down the call tree, which is this structure, and I just click through everything that's like the highest level of percentages, I come here, and then you see that the 80% that you have is divided in like 3 levels. 42% goes to the block page build. The Drupal alter hooks are being called that do some alterations to the page. In this case, it's like translation and stuff. And here it's the rendering of the HTML. So in Drupal you have render arrays which convert array structures with properties to HTML strings. But the 42% is quite interesting because it's the largest one, and I'm a noob, so I don't know what's going on there. I don't know the project, so what kind of blocks are you building that takes so much of the time? Well, I click through it, and again, and again, and again, and then I get here. And then there are 2 things that catch my eye. One is the fuse block view, and one is a bring mon card block view. Well, the project is called Bringman, so my guess is this is custom code written by an idiot. And the other one is default Drupal, and seems to be from the views module, and the views module is like a query system that creates listings of content. So it's like a site building tool to gather content from entities, in this case a listing of products, and which is not being cached apparently, because every request that I run this, I get the same time, percentage time on this view. So 20% of my page call goes to showing like 8 products. And every page call shows the same products. So that can be optimized. I mean, if every page call on a day probably is the same list of products, why doing this real time every time again and again and again? So what I did here was go through views, go to the caching settings, turn it on. I went back and this went to 2%. So I had like a 20% gain on performance from a request by just switching a default setting in Drupal on that wasn't on. So you have to find it out. You know, you can check every page, every configuration, but this gives you direct insight into how your code behaves, and therefore ideas about how to optimize it, especially when you know your framework. But there's also a piece of code that takes like 10% of my request that I don't know. I do know because I built it and I didn't do it well, but that's another story. And what I see here is that it tries to render a card, apparently. So it wants to render probably the books that you have added to your cart as a user and show it and do this real time every page load, which does make sense because there are two things hard in programming. One is naming things and the other is cache invalidation. And this kind of things, yeah, you have to build something that invalidates caches when this a certain order changes when you add something to the cart. So probably because of time or maybe not enough knowledge about how to do this, we built this cart and therefore created a performance decrease of 10% for a custom block. So what happens in the code? Well, this is the piece of code. Apparently I just load an order. I put it in some function that creates an overview and do this every time and every time again. And if you're a user and you try to move into the shoes of a user, how much products do you add and remove during your visit? I mean, you browse a lot, you search for your products, but it's not like you're add, remove like 2,000 times. So, essentially, you might say that this can be cached and just let it invalidate the moment something changes about the cart. So what can we do about it? Well, we had two techniques that we could use. We had memorization, but that's within the same request. So using this would only make sense if we use this piece of yeah, Redis would be better, exactly. Memorization wouldn't, because if I use this block on multiple pages, yeah, then it makes sense, but you show the card mostly on one place on the page, so caching that in a static variable doesn't really make sense. It does make, does for the order, for instance. You can, Drupal 7 does it already with entities often. So if you use order for multiple functionality, like a card or, I don't know, some kind of message that you want to show, or I don't know, some other block or information about the state of your order, then it makes sense to cache, statically cache the order within the request. But this HTML string that you want to output somewhere on the page, yeah, that's most of the time on one place. So what we did was we loaded the order. I see that I have put here an older piece of code. Live coding. So. Well, let's say in this case I don't need the order because I just want the order ID, because in the previous code I only want the order ID, because if I give the order ID to the embed view, then apparently my card is being rendered. So one of the optimizations I did was not loading the order, but just gain the order ID from my session. That's what the function does. Then I just want generate some way a cache ID that I want to use to know that this is an original ID for my order and my user, and store it in some kind of cache bin using a certain cache API within the framework that I use. So in this case, I say I got a mini card with this order ID, and every order ID is unique to a user, so I don't have to worry about the user ID, and I want to store it in the cache bin in this case. This is a quite simple solution. So once I know what the cache ID should be, I'll try to get it from my cache, and in this case a cache could be Redis, it could be Memcache, it could be a database cache, it could be Mongo, I don't know, go crazy and decide what you want to use. So I'll check, okay, I got an order ID, do I have cache? Do I have a cache item that's not invalidated that I can use and output directly without going through this piece of logic? So this check will do that, because if the cache gets something from the storage, it will validate, it will return the cache from the data in the content and just return it to the output, just as the original situation did here. If not, if I don't have a cache item with data that I want to output, it means that I have to rebuild it. Probably it's the first time the card block is being requested, or the cache has been invalidated for some reason, and I want to regenerate it. So I can skip this doesn't happen. I get the data using the same logic I did before, just give the order ID to the embed. And then I say, use the cache API available to me in the framework, set it with the generated cache ID because it's generated based on the order ID. Store it in the cache bin that I want to use, and return it as well to the front end for output. Two things, more like a small code quality thing. Using methods or some kind of a generic way to define your cache IDs and cache bin makes it also possible to use it in other situations, like when invalidating. So when something changes, in this case with Drupal 7 they have like a hook system that says, okay, when an entity changes we have like an insert update save hook that you can trigger. So when an entity updates, I get an entity of a specific type. In this case I check here if the type is a commerce order, and I want to generate the cache ID that I expect based on the order ID, because that's changed apparently because we're saving it with this hook. And I want to clear every item with this cache ID within the bin. And this way my cache is being invalidated as soon as my order is changed for that specific order. So even if multiple users use the same order, my cache is being invalidated. So that's also nice if you have like a multi-user shared order system or something. And the next time the block is being built, the correct card is being rendered with the updated information. This type of optimization using this cache API for external storages, or even implementing like memorization, improves the page sometimes, in this case 50%. We had a page load of like 2 seconds without using page caches from Drupal, and implementing this logic on certain places increased it to 1 second by just small changes. Very simple, few lines of code, and you're done. A small tip for our Drupal developers. For Drupal 7 there's also a module called block cache alter, and what you can see in this block, for instance, there's no cache setting set. It says this block can never be cached. That's the whole point of the reason why it's not cached, because when should it be cached, when should it be invalidated, I can't determine it from the Drupal 7 API. But there are some blocks within Drupal that have the same setting but can be cached, and in certain situations. One of these are menu blocks. Menu blocks are not cached, and it's not a joke, and because it can contain links which are access and permission regulated. But often a lot of menus for anonymous user don't have access validation based on roles because it's available to the anonymous user, so it's available to everybody. Those menus could have caching based on each page. With block cache alter for Drupal 7 you can change from the block settings in your interface. You can set a no cache situation to a setting by page or by role and page or whatever. So you have some slightly configuration from the site building perspective without implementing all kinds of hooks and alters to get this. So
yeah, so we go to the results, because keep in mind we only had 2 days to fix this, all of this, together, combined. So 1 day for Jeffrey and 1 day for me. That's the only price the client wanted to pay for optimizing the site. Well, fine.
cheapskate.
Story of our life.
I'm getting Dick. I know if you're watching, but sorry.
This is for you, Jeff.
Yeah, so like I told before, we had like a 50% performance increase by just doing those backend improvements. In PHP 7 it was from 1 second to 600 milliseconds, but PHP 7 performs better. Running on our hosting environment it was from 2 seconds to like 1 second, but I'll show you later. And another funny thing is if you compare the profiling files that you generate when you're optimizing function for function, and because it's like it's an iterative process, because once you solve like 40% of your issues, something that was 20% might become 40% because those the balance between those percentages shift because of this. But what's also funny is that your profiling file sizes decrease as well, because the complexity and the number of code that's being executed is being decreased by the optimizations that you've done. So we had initial files of 4 MB with data, and eventually it was like 1 MB. So that was pretty funny to see. Then we have the results when we went to the acceptation environment. It's not on production yet because our client is on a conference. So small side note, this is not cached with Cloudflare. So there are some things that are less performant, like CSS minification that's not being done yet. But what you can see here, this is the original request time on production, which is actually more performant than acceptation. And this is after the performance optimization that we have done together.
So there's 50% decrease, so like 1 second gain on that page.
Yeah. Content type breakdown that we had in the beginning was like 4.5 MB on images, while the rest was somewhat decreased because of the compression done by Cloudflare. We went from 4.5 MB to 370 kilobytes. JavaScript increased because the compression is not done yet, so we're still curious about what kind of gain we get when this is going to the Cloudflare side. And CSS
is 2/3 of what it was originally.
Yeah. So this is compressed online with the current non-efficient CSS. So this is minified and uglified and whatnot. And this isn't minified and is already smaller. So this might be like, when it's compressed, like 1/3 probably, I guess, of what it originally was, maybe a half. And these are the Google PageSpeed Insight gains we got from the expectation environment.
And this is without Cloudflare?
Without Cloudflare. So if you calculate the gains we got like 20 points increase on both on mobile and desktop when Cloudflare was between us. This would mean that the total results will be around 95 and 94 when this goes to production. So we went from like 30 points to 95 points in an investment of 16 hours on front and back end. So yeah, this is what we've done, and this is yeah, the performance gains that we did. Do you have any questions?
Was Cloudflare also doing aggregation of the CSS files?
No, that's on the Drupal side. Yeah, and that's with the measurements we did turned off, also on production, just so we had a good grip on the amount of files that were loaded. And page caching was of course turned off as well. Because if page caching was turned on for anonymous users, the page load would be a lot lower, because then it would be, I don't know, the direct HTML to the front end. And for that kind of stuff, anonymous users have probably with Drupal as well pretty performant website, because those pages are mostly cached. But when using like a cart, you're not anonymous anymore. At least we don't know your name yet, but you have a cart, you're personalized, so you have your own order, your own session, so the page can't be cached anymore. For this kind of solutions, there are options, even within Drupal 7, and mostly they are wrapped around the idea that personalized content is being loaded in through Ajax, while the rest of the page is cached as static HTML. For Drupal 7, this could mean using auth cache. We successfully implemented that for a web shop, and authenticate users who are logged in as well have a page load of under 100 milliseconds. And a cart and a personalized user menu is loaded in on the fly with Ajax in this case. So you can gain pretty good performance gains with those kind of solutions. Drupal 8, for instance, has render caching, that's kind of systems which are more performant than Drupal 7, and well, there are loads of other options, varnish or whatever. Any other questions? There's a load of questions for you. When I ask questions, it's nothing.
We'll get back to Bear, I guess.
Ja.
Well,
Wat afsluiten? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming here. I do the closing in English. So if you have any recommendations or advice for us, please let us know in Meetup. And if you want to be here next time, that would be very nice. We're looking forward to see you in about 3 months, I guess. And also tips and advice for subjects are very welcome. So have a nice week and stay a little bit longer, and have a nice journey home. Thank you.